Richard Hale left his wife Margaret after 30 years of marriage, all for Leona, a bride he believed was just 25. But accountant Samuel uncovered secrets that Detective Harris would later confirm. Leona was 45, with 6 hidden children, and a past stained by vanished men. What Richard thought was love quickly turned into a nightmare, one that ended with his mysterious disappearance. Did Leona orchestrate it all, or did Margaret silently watch her husband walk into his own destruction? Richard Hale had always been the kind of man who wanted more than what he had. To outsiders he seemed like someone who had it all: a spacious house, a profitable business, and a wife who had stood by him through every storm life threw their way. Margaret had been with him for nearly 30 years, a woman of quiet strength, who had given him stability and loyalty. But for Richard, that stability had grown stale. The routine dinners, the comfortable silence in their home, and the predictable way each day unfolded had begun to suffocate him. He convinced himself he was living half a life, waiting for something exciting to come along. That something, or rather someone, appeared when he least expected it. Her name was Leona, and she seemed like a dream come true. She was everything Margaret was not: youthful, vibrant, and endlessly flattering. At least, that was the image she crafted for Richard. When he first met her, he could not believe that a woman who appeared no older than 25 would even glance in his direction, let alone look at him with the kind of admiration he had longed for. She had a way of making him feel important, as though he had discovered a fountain of youth by simply being in her company. Her laughter was sharp yet inviting, her gaze always lingering just long enough to pull him deeper into her orbit. Richard began to change almost immediately. He stayed out later, spent more money than usual, and returned home smelling of expensive cologne. Margaret had never bought him. The lies he told were small at first, but they grew into a tangled web he could not escape. Margaret noticed, of course. She noticed everything: the way his phone was suddenly password protected, the way he avoided her eyes when she asked about his day, the way his voice grew distant whenever he said her name. Still, she didn't confront him. She carried her silence like a blade, sharp and ready, while Richard drifted further away. Leona knew exactly how to play him. She spoke about the life they could have together, painting pictures of beaches, travel, and passion. She whispered about how age didn't matter, that love was timeless, and that Richard deserved to feel alive again. Slowly, she became the center of his world. Margaret's devotion, her decades of sacrifice, became invisible under the blinding glow of Leona's attention. Richard started resenting the home he had built with Margaret. He saw the walls as suffocating, the memories as shackles, and the woman he once adored as nothing more than an anchor dragging him down. The decision to leave Margaret did not come with guilt, but with excitement. Richard believed he was breaking free from monotony and stepping into a new life filled with passion. His friends warned him. Samuel, his accountant, quietly advised caution, noting the strange inconsistencies in Leona's background. But Richard was deaf to reason. In his mind he was not a fool but a man brave enough to chase happiness where others were too timid to look. Margaret's heart broke quietly in the shadows while Richard celebrated what he thought was a victory. Yet even in his moments of triumph, when he imagined his future with Leona, there was an unease he could not quite explain. It crept in late at night in the quiet moments when her stories didn't add up, or when her eyes seemed to calculate more than they adored. But Richard dismissed those thoughts as paranoia. He clung to the fantasy, refusing to accept that anything could be wrong. He had traded his marriage, his reputation, and his peace of mind for this woman. There was no turning back. He believed he had escaped into a new beginning. What he didn't know was that he had just stepped into a trap carefully designed for him, a trap that would soon close with a force he could never imagine. The wedding was meant to be the crowning moment of Richard's new life, the final severing of ties from the world he left behind, and the beginning of something he believed was youthful and exhilarating. He spared no expense, choosing his countryside estate as the setting, a sprawling property with manicured lawns and a grand hall that could host hundreds. Yet for all its grandeur, The guest list was surprisingly small. Richard explained it away as wanting intimacy, but in truth, many people had declined the invitation. His divorce from Margaret had already soured opinions of him, and whispers about his bride's mysterious past had made more than a few friends uneasy. Still, Richard ignored the shadows of doubt. He told himself they were jealous, bitter, unable to understand the happiness he had found. Leona arrived draped in ivory silk, her gown shimmering beneath the sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows. She looked every bit the young bride, her face painted flawlessly, her hair curled into soft waves that framed her delicate features. Yet beneath the surface there was something oddly practiced in her smile, something too rehearsed in the way she moved. Guests noticed the way she avoided candid photographs, always tilting her head so shadows hid parts of her face, the way she spoke quickly and deflected questions about her family. She laughed when people asked about her parents, claiming they lived far away, and grew vague when conversations turned toward her past. Most assumed she was shy, nervous about being surrounded by strangers. Only a few sensed there was more to it than nerve. Among the few who truly watched was Samuel, Richard's longtime accountant. Samuel had seen Richard through years of business deals and personal missteps, and though he rarely spoke out of turn, he couldn't ignore the gnawing unease Leona inspired in him. Something about her didn't add up. The identification documents Richard had asked him to review had odd details, numbers that didn't align, dates that suggested a history carefully trimmed to fit a specific narrative. He mentioned it once to Richard, gently, only to be met with irritation and dismissal. Richard insisted everything was in order, that Samuel was overthinking. Still, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the woman standing before them was not who she claimed to be. Margaret, though not present, weighed heavily on the minds of many guests. Her absence was a silent reminder of what Richard had sacrificed for this new life. Rumor had it she had refused to even acknowledge the ceremony, retreating into her quiet routines while the town gossiped behind her back. Some pitied her, some admired her composure, but others whispered that her silence was far more dangerous than it appeared. Richard didn't give her a second thought that day. He was too busy parading his new bride through the lavish hall, dancing under the glittering chandeliers as though he had conquered the world. But the unease lingered. Even as the music played and the champagne flowed, there was an undercurrent of suspicion. Leona rarely spoke unless prompted, and when she did, her words carried a strange detachment. She seemed to watch people more than engage with them, her eyes darting as though measuring every guest, every reaction, every slip of information that might betray her. To Richard, this was confidence. To others, it looked like calculation. As the night ended, and the guests departed, whispers followed them into the cool air. Some said Leona was hiding something. Others claimed Richard was blinded by desire and pride. Samuel, driving home alone, replayed every detail of the evening in his mind. The heavy makeup, the avoidance of photographs, the vague answers. He told himself it wasn't his place to interfere any further, but he knew better. Something had been planted in his mind that would not leave him. Richard, however, was oblivious. He looked at Leona with the eyes of a man who believed he had triumphed over age and circumstance. He thought he had married youth, vitality, and a chance at starting over. What he did not see was the mask his new wife wore. A mask that would soon begin to slip, revealing truths far darker than anyone could have imagined. It did not take long for the shine of Richard's new marriage to begin fading. At first, the differences were small, almost invisible to someone blinded by love, but soon they became cracks too wide to ignore. Leona, who had once seemed endlessly affectionate, now spent long hours away from the house without explanation. She claimed errands, visits, or business of her own, but never gave specifics. When Richard pressed, she brushed him off with quick, dismissive words that left him feeling foolish for asking. Nights were even stranger. The phone would ring late, long after Richard had gone to bed. Leona would slip into another room, whispering in a hushed tone that made her words impossible to catch. By the time she returned, Her expression was carefully blank, her smile fixed in place as though nothing unusual had happened. Richard's unease grew, but he buried it under excuses. He told himself she was young and deserved her freedom, but he was old-fashioned for wanting to know her every move. Still, a knot tightened in his chest every time she disappeared, and it tightened even more when she returned with no explanation. The fantasy he had built was slipping, yet he clung to it with desperation. The thought of admitting he had made a mistake was unbearable. He had left Margaret, humiliated himself, and shattered his reputation. If Leona was not who she seemed, then his entire life had become nothing but a monument to foolishness. While Richard battled his doubts in silence, Samuel was piecing together what Richard refused to see. As Richard's accountant, he had access to records and financial transfers, and something about them made him pause. He noticed Leona's name appearing in accounts that had never existed before. Small sums at first, then larger ones. Each payment moved quickly into other accounts under different names. At first, Samuel thought it was simple mismanagement, but the deeper he dug, the darker the picture became. The money was being funneled toward individuals who all shared the same surname, 6 in total. The discovery sent a chill through him. If they were relatives, why had Leona never mentioned them? And why was she receiving such large sums from Richard without his knowledge of where it went? Samuel spent hours combing through public records, and when the truth surfaced, it was even more startling than he had imagined. Leona had 6 children. Their ages ranged from teenagers to young adults, and each lived only a short distance from where she and Richard now resided. Samuel sat in his office late into the night, staring at the documents spread across his desk. It was impossible to ignore. Leona was not the woman she had claimed to be. She wasn't a young, carefree 25-year-old looking for love. She was closer to Richard's own age, around 45. And her so-called fresh start was built on lies stacked as carefully as cards in a house destined to collapse. The 6 children, hidden just out of sight, were proof that she had constructed a double life and dragged Richard into it without his knowledge. Meanwhile, Richard began noticing smaller details that now gnawed at his conscience. He saw faint lines beneath Leona's heavy makeup, subtle signs of age. She had gone to great lengths to conceal. Her stories about her childhood never stayed consistent. Dates shifted, details changed as though she couldn't remember the lies she had told before. Once, when Richard accidentally glanced at a letter addressed to her, he caught a different name entirely. Leona had snatched it from his hands before he could read more, her face darkening for just a second before she masked it with a smile. The unease Richard had once brushed off as paranoia now returned in full force, but still he did not act. He told himself it was stress, that he needed to trust the woman he had chosen. Yet deep down, something inside him whispered that he had stepped into a life built on deception. He didn't know it yet, but the truth Samuel had uncovered was already closing in, and the illusion Richard had traded everything for was about to collapse around him in ways more devastating than he could ever imagine. Samuel could not keep the truth to himself any longer. The moment he confirmed Leona's real age and the existence of 6 children, he felt a weight pressing down on him, demanding action. He arranged a private meeting with Richard, bringing with him the papers, the records, and the undeniable evidence that Leona had built her new identity on lies. When Samuel spread the documents across the desk, Richard stared in disbelief, his hands trembling as his eyes scanned the dates, names, and numbers that stripped away the illusion he had clung to so desperately. The truth was impossible to deny. His beautiful, youthful bride was in fact 45 years old, a mother of 6, and a woman who had carefully orchestrated every detail to make herself appear younger and unattached. For a long while, Richard said nothing. His pride was bleeding in silence. To admit he had been tricked was to admit that he had ruined his marriage and reputation for a fantasy that never existed. Rage simmered beneath his humiliation. He had paraded Leona around as proof that he still had charm and power, but in reality, he had been the perfect mark for a woman who knew exactly how to exploit weakness. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and cold, but behind it was a storm of fear. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but Samuel urged caution. There was something about Leona's deception that suggested more than just greed. Samuel's unease deepened when he discovered hints of past identities linked to Leona, names that had appeared in other towns, always tied to men who had mysteriously disappeared. As Richard wrestled with the enormity of what he had learned, he began noticing what he had ignored before. The sharpness in Leona's gaze whenever she thought no one was watching, the way she studied his assets and properties more than she seemed to study him, the sudden interest she had taken in his will and insurance policies. She asked questions with a softness in her voice, but calculation in her eyes. The stories of her past grew even more fractured. Slight inconsistencies that once seemed meaningless now screamed of fabrication. He began to wonder how much of the woman he thought he loved had ever truly existed. Samuel's research grew darker with each layer he peeled back. He unearthed a trail of legal disputes tied to women with Leona's old names. There were whispers of fraud, records of sudden financial windfalls, and unsettling gaps where men simply vanished without explanation. One case stood out. A man in another city, wealthier even than Richard, had disappeared after marrying a woman with striking similarities to Leona. The investigation had ended without resolution, the woman moving on without consequence. Samuel feared history was repeating itself. Richard's mind spiraled. He had not just been deceived, he might be in danger. He recalled the sharp tone in her voice when she thought he was asleep, speaking into the phone late at night. He remembered how she avoided introducing him to anyone from her supposed past. He began to wonder if her 6 children were simply hidden dependents or willing accomplices in a scheme larger than he could imagine. Every unexplained absence, every late-night call, every evasive answer became a piece of a sinister puzzle. Margaret lingered in his thoughts as well. He imagined her cold silence, her refusal to intervene as he tore their marriage apart. Had she suspected all along? Had she known that he was walking straight into a trap? The thought haunted him. Margaret had watched him ruin himself, and perhaps she had seen what he had been too blinded to notice. The walls seemed to close in on Richard. He could no longer look at his wife without imagining the mask peeling away, revealing a stranger with motives darker than desire. He felt caught in a web spun tightly around him, each strand pulling him further into a design he could not yet see. The realization came slowly, creeping into his mind until it consumed him. Leona had not chosen him out of love. She had chosen him as her next target, and if the whispers about her past were true, then her plans for him would not end with betrayal, they would end with his disappearance, just like the men before him. The storm rolled in on a Thursday night, heavy clouds swallowing the sky, as thunder rattled the windows of Richard's countryside estate. Rain pounded the earth in relentless sheets, turning the roads into rivers of mud and drowning out every sound except the crack of lightning above. It was on this night that Richard vanished. The details would never be entirely clear, but what was discovered left investigators and neighbors unsettled for years. Richard's car was found the following morning on a deserted rural road, parked neatly as though it had been left there deliberately. The keys were still in the ignition, but the doors were locked, and the inside showed no signs of a struggle. His phone, however, was missing. There were muddy footprints near the driver's side door, washed partially away by the night's downpour, leading into the dense woods that stretched for miles. To the police, it looked as though Richard had willingly stepped out of his car and vanished into the storm. Detective Harris was assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for inconsistencies. He arrived at the scene shortly after the car was discovered and immediately sensed that the disappearance was not a random event. Richard Hale was not the type of man to abandon his possessions in the middle of nowhere, nor was he the type to disappear without leaving a trace. Something had lured him to that lonely stretch of road, and Harris intended to uncover. The first person he questioned was Leona. She played her role convincingly, presenting herself as the heartbroken wife, her face pale and tear-streaked, her voice trembling as she spoke about her missing husband. She claimed Richard had been under stress, that he often drove alone to clear his mind, and perhaps the storm had forced him to seek shelter. Her performance was convincing enough to stir sympathy from some, But Harris remained unconvinced. He noted the calculated pauses in her answers, the way she seemed to choose her words carefully, as if rehearsed, and beneath the sorrow in her eyes he caught flickers of something else, something colder, something closer to relief than grief. As investigators searched for Richard, attention inevitably turned to Margaret. She had been humiliated, discarded after 30 years of marriage, replaced by a younger bride in front of the entire community. Her silence during the scandal had unsettled many. She never publicly confronted Richard or Leona, never fought for attention or sympathy. She simply retreated into herself, continuing her routines as though nothing had changed. Now, with Richard missing, that silence became something darker in the eyes of the town. People whispered that Margaret had finally snapped, that beneath her quiet demeanor had been a rage waiting for the right moment to surface. Some suggested she had orchestrated Richard's disappearance as the ultimate act of revenge, a punishment for his betrayal. The town buzzed with speculation, but the truth was far murkier. Richard had been unraveling in the days before the storm, his paranoia growing by the hour. Samuel later admitted that Richard had confided fragments of his fears to him. Strange phone calls, inconsistencies in Leona's stories, the gnawing feeling that his new wife was not simply dishonest, but dangerous. He had spoken of confronting her, of demanding the truth about her past and her children. Samuel worried that Richard had finally done so on that stormy night, and that confrontation might have sealed his fate. Detective Harris pressed further into Leona's history, but each attempt was met with walls of false identities and carefully hidden records. Nothing about her past was stable, everything shifting like sand in a storm. Harris began to suspect that Richard's disappearance was not just about betrayal or revenge, but about something far larger, a pattern stretching back years. The missing men, the false names, the trail of financial gains, all of it pointed toward a predator hiding in plain sight. Yet Margaret's shadow lingered over the case, and the question refused to leave anyone's mind. Had she stood by quietly, waiting for Richard's destruction, or had she played a hidden hand in pushing him toward it? As the rain-soaked days passed and no trace of Richard appeared, suspicion hardened into fear. Whatever had happened that night, one fact was undeniable. Richard Hale had stepped out of his life and into a darkness from which he would never return. Detective Harris knew from the beginning that Richard's disappearance was not the work of chance. The storm might have erased much of the evidence, but enough fragments remained to suggest something sinister had unfolded. The muddy footprints near the abandoned car told a story of movement into the woods, but there were no prints leading back out. Dogs brought to the site caught Richard's scent but lost it abruptly near a remote cabin a mile away. The discovery set the course of the investigation toward a grim conclusion. The cabin was old, tucked away among trees that seemed to swallow it whole. Inside, the smell of damp wood mixed with something metallic and unsettling. At first glance, the space appeared empty, abandoned for years, but Harris's flashlight revealed otherwise. The floorboards bore fresh scratches, and in one corner, the earth beneath the planks had been disturbed. On the wooden floor near the hearth, faint stains glistened under the beam of light. Forensic tests confirmed what Harris already suspected: the blood belonged to Richard Hale. The revelation shattered any lingering hope that Richard had merely run away. He had been in that cabin on the night up the storm, and whatever happened there ended violently. All trails led back to Leona, and Harris wasted no time confronting her. She wept again, her performance almost flawless, insisting she knew nothing of the cabin or the stains found inside. But cracks began to show. When asked why Richard's phone pinged near the location of that cabin just hours before it was switched off forever, her eyes flickered, betraying her. The deeper Harris dug, the clearer the picture became. The 6 children Samuel had uncovered were not simply hidden dependents. They were accomplices. Interviews revealed how closely they orbited around their mother, how fiercely loyal they were to her, and how heavily they relied on the financial lifeline Richard had unknowingly provided. The oldest, under pressure, let slip fragments of the truth, enough to piece together the chilling events of that night. Richard had confronted Leona with what he had learned, demanding explanations she could not provide. He had threatened to leave her, to expose her deception, and to cut off the money flowing into accounts that supported her family. To Leona, it was not just a threat to her lifestyle, it was a threat to the empire she had built through years of lies. On the night of the storm, Richard had been lured to the cabin under the guise of reconciliation. He went willingly, unaware that Leona's children were waiting. What followed was swift, violent, and meticulously concealed. Though none of them admitted to delivering the final blow, their overlapping accounts painted the picture of a man overpowered, silenced, and erased from the life he had traded everything to create. His body was disposed of in a way no one would fully confess, each child insisting another knew more than they did. For investigators, the trail ended in fragments, enough to charge, but never enough to fully close the case. Leona was arrested, her mask finally torn away for all to see. The image of the radiant young bride collapsed, replaced by the truth of a woman who had built her life on manipulation, fraud, and predation. Her children were taken in for questioning, some charged as accessories, others spared but scarred by their involvement. Still, one question refused to leave Harris's mind. How had Richard ignored so many warning signs, and why had Margaret never intervened? Margaret's role became the final twist in a story already dripping with betrayal. Harris discovered that long before Richard married Leona, Margaret had quietly hired Samuel to look into the woman's past. She had known the lies, the inconsistencies, the danger, yet she had said nothing. She had watched silently as Richard tore apart their marriage and walked willingly into the snare. When asked why she hadn't spoken, Margaret simply replied that Richard would never have listened. And perhaps, in her silence, she found the justice that life had denied her. The case closed with Leona behind bars, her empire shattered, her children scattered and broken. Richard's body was never recovered, his final resting place a secret buried as deeply as the lies that led him there. The town never stopped whispering. Some believed Leona had hidden him where no one would ever find him, while others suspected Margaret knew more than she ever revealed. What remained certain was that Richard Hale's hunger for youth and beauty had destroyed him. The wife he abandoned lived on in quiet dignity, the woman he chose rotted in prison, and his name became a cautionary tale of deception, pride, and the deadly cost of ignoring the truth.